Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Location: Gates of the Arctic National Park, Alaska. Date: September 4th, 2019. The aurora came early that year. Morgan noticed it during her pre-dawn instrument check, a ripple of green light dancing across the northern horizon, while the sky was still caught between darkness and the pale suggestion of morning. September and Gates of the Arctic usually brought the first reliable displays of the northern lights, but not like this. Not this bright, not this early, not with that strange pulsing rhythm that made the light seem almost alive. She watched it for a long moment through the hangar's frost-rimed windows, her coffee cooling in her hands, feeling something she couldn't quite name. Unease, maybe, or recognition, as if some ancient part of her brain remembered what those lights meant and was trying to warn the rest of her. 15 years she'd been flying rescue operations in Alaska, the last 7 based out of Bettles, the tiny village that served as the primary access point for Gates of the Arctic. She'd seen every kind of weather this land could produce, survived whiteouts that reduced visibility to inches, landed her Bell 407 on mountainsides that would make most pilots refuse to even attempt approach. The Arctic had tried to kill her more times than she could count, and she'd developed a healthy respect for its indifference. This wasn't a place that cared whether you lived or died. It simply was, vast and ancient and utterly unconcerned with human survival. But the aurora this morning felt different. It felt like it was paying attention. Morgan shook off the thought and returned to her checklist. The helicopter needed a thorough pre-flight inspection. The temperatures had dropped unexpectedly overnight, and ice could form in places that would kill you if you weren't careful. She moved through the routine with practiced efficiency, checking rotor assemblies, hydraulic lines, fuel systems. Her hands knew this work so well they could do it blind, leaving her mind free to wander, which was not always a blessing. The radio in the hangar crackled to life just as she was finishing up. "Bettles Base, this is Fairbanks Dispatch. We've got a situation developing. Do you copy?" Morgan crossed to the console and keyed the mic. "Fairbanks Bettles Base, this is Morgan Chen. I copy. Go ahead." "Morgan, we've got a spot beacon activation in the Arrogetch Peaks area. Coordinates 67.42 north, 154.18 west. Signal's been active for about 3 hours. No registered permits for that location. No flight plans filed. We need eyes on it." Morgan frowned. The Arrogetch Peaks were some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in a park that was already defined by remoteness and danger. Sheer granite spires rising thousands of feet from glacial valleys. Weather that could change from clear to deadly in minutes. Nobody went there without serious preparation and extensive paperwork. An unregistered beacon activation could mean anything from a malfunctioning device to a climber in serious trouble. "Copy, Fairbanks. I can be airborne in 20. What's the weather looking like up there?" A pause, then, "That's the thing, Morgan. Conditions are showing clear right now, but there's a front moving in faster than predicted. You've got maybe a 4-hour window before it gets ugly, and there's something else." "Go ahead." "The beacon's registration. It's coming back to a William Prescott. We ran the name through the system." Another pause, longer this time. "Morgan, William Prescott was reported missing in Gates of the Arctic in 1979. He was never found." Morgan stared at the radio for a long moment. "Say again, Fairbanks? 1979? "Confirmed. The beacon is a PLB model that wasn't manufactured until 2015. Registered to William Prescott, date of birth, March 15th, 1951. Same social security number as the missing person from 40 years ago. We don't know what to make of it." Neither did Morgan. But she'd been doing this job long enough to know that the wilderness didn't always follow the rules that made sense. She'd found hikers who'd walked in circles for days, convinced they were making progress. She'd recovered bodies in places that should have been impossible to reach. Once, 3 years ago, she'd located a crashed Cessna that had been missing for 20 years. the pilot's logbook still open to an entry dated the day of the crash, the ink not even faded. The Arctic kept its secrets. Sometimes it gave them back. I'm wheels up in 15, Fairbanks. I'll report when I have visual on the beacon location. William Prescott had been hiking for 3 days when the sky changed. He'd set out from the Arroghetch Creek drainage on a solo expedition, one of dozens he'd undertaken since first discovering this wilderness in his early 20s. At 28, he was an experienced backcountry traveler, comfortable with the solitude and the challenges of the Alaskan interior. His goal was to reach the base of Xanadu, one of the massive granite towers that defined the Arroghetch skyline, and spend a week photographing the autumn colors against the stark gray stone. He'd done everything right, filed his permits, told his wife his exact route and expected return date, packed for every contingency. The first 2 days had been perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the 40s, good progress through terrain that demanded respect but rewarded careful navigation. He'd made camp the second night on a small bench overlooking the valley below, watching the stars emerge in a sky so dark and clear, they seemed close enough to touch. That night, the aurora began. It wasn't like any northern lights William had seen before. Instead of the usual curtains of green and white, these lights moved with purpose, concentrating over a single point on the horizon and pulsing in rhythms that seemed almost like breathing. The colors were wrong too. Not just green, but deep violet and a shade of red that made him think of blood spreading through water. William had photographed the aurora dozens of times, but he couldn't bring himself to raise his camera to this display. Something about it felt private, forbidden, like accidentally witnessing a ritual he wasn't meant to see. He crawled into his tent and tried to sleep, but the light kept pulsing through the fabric, casting shifting shadows that never quite resolved into recognizable shapes. When he finally dozed off near dawn, his dreams were full of doorways that opened onto nothing, and voices speaking in languages that predated words. The third day was when things stopped making sense. William broke camp and continued his route toward Xanadu, following the drainage northwest. The terrain was familiar from his topo maps, or it should have been, but the landmarks weren't matching up. A ridge that should have been on his left was somehow on his right. A stream he needed to cross appeared to be flowing uphill. His compass spun lazily in its housing, never settling on any particular direction. And the silence. That was the worst part. The Arroghetch should have been alive with sound. The whistle of pikas in the talus slopes, the distant roar of water through the gorges, the ever-present wind that scoured these high valleys. But there was nothing. An absolute, crushing silence that pressed against William's eardrums like a physical weight. He found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his own respiration would disturb something that was listening. That was when he saw the figure. It stood perhaps 200 yards away on a boulder that jutted from the valley floor like a dark tooth. Human-shaped, roughly, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the head tilted at an angle that no neck should allow. It wasn't moving, but William had the sudden, terrifying certainty that it had been moving just a moment ago, and that it would start moving again the instant he looked away. He ran. The terrain that had been so clear and navigable before was suddenly hostile, the rocks shifting under his feet. The ground sloping in directions his eyes insisted were level. William scrambled up a scree slope and over a ridge that led nowhere, down into a valley that hadn't been there a moment ago. The silence followed him, but now there were sounds beneath it, whispers just below the threshold of hearing, words in a language older than human speech. When he finally stopped, gasping for breath, he found himself standing in a cirque he didn't recognize. High granite walls rose on 3 sides, their faces carved by millennia of ice into shapes that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing. The sky above was wrong. It was afternoon. It should have been afternoon. But the light was the pale silver of either dawn or dusk, and the aurora was back, pulsing directly overhead in that same breathing rhythm. And there, in the center of the cirque, was a doorway. Not a natural formation. A doorway, carved or worn or simply existing in defiance of everything William understood about reality. It stood perhaps 10 feet tall, framed by stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Through the opening, William could see nothing. Not darkness, not light. An absence so complete that his eyes refused to focus on it. The whispers were louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Coming from the doorway. Coming from inside his own head. William felt his legs carrying him forward. He wasn't walking by choice. His body was moving on its own, responding to something deeper than conscious thought. The doorway grew larger as he approached, or perhaps the space around it was shrinking, compressing, folding in on itself. The whispers resolved into words he almost understood, promises of something beyond time, beyond the slow decay of seconds into minutes, into years, into the inevitable silence of death. The aurora pulsed one final time, so bright it burned shadows into his vision, and William Prescott stepped through the doorway and was gone. Morgan found the beacon's location after 40 minutes of flight, the coordinates leading her to a high cirque in the Arrogech that she'd never approached before. The weather was holding, but barely. Clouds were building to the west, their edges tinged with the particular yellow-gray that meant serious snow. She had maybe 2 hours before conditions would force her back to Bettles. The cirque itself was unremarkable at first glance. Granite walls, glacial debris, a small tarn reflecting the moody sky. But as Morgan circled, looking for a place to land, she noticed the rocks. They were arranged in patterns that didn't look natural, concentric circles and spiraling lines that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. And in the center of the largest circle, lying motionless on the bare stone, was a person. Fairbanks, Bettles one. I have visual on a possible victim at the beacon coordinates. Single individual, appears unconscious. I'm setting down to investigate. Copy, Bettles 1. Be advised, that weather system is accelerating. You've got less than 2 hours now. Update when you have more information. Morgan brought the helicopter down on a relatively flat section of talus about 50 yards from the figure, her rotors kicking up clouds of grit and lichen. She killed the engine but left the battery on, the instrument panel casting a faint glow in the increasingly dim light. The aurora was visible even now, in what should have been mid-afternoon. Curtains of green and violet dancing across the northern sky with that same strange rhythm she'd noticed at dawn. She approached the figure carefully, her medical kit in one hand, her radio in the other. It was a man lying on his back, eyes closed, wearing clothing that was completely wrong for the environment. Cotton pants, a flannel shirt, leather hiking boots that might have been fashionable in the 70s, but had no business on a modern Alaskan expedition. His face was young, late 20s maybe, with a short beard and sun-weathered skin. He appeared to be breathing. Sir, can you hear me? Morgan knelt beside him, checking for obvious injuries. Nothing visible, pulse strong and regular. Skin temperature normal. He shouldn't be alive dressed like this in temperatures that had been near freezing for days, with no shelter visible anywhere in the cirque. The man's eyes opened. They were wrong. Not the wrong color. They were a normal hazel, perfectly human. But there was something behind them that didn't fit. A depth that had no bottom. A patience that had nothing to do with human timelines. What year is it? The man asked. His voice was rusty, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. A very long time. Morgan hesitated. It's 2019 September. Sir, what's your name? How long have you been out here? The man sat up slowly, looking around the cirque with an expression of confused recognition. 2019, he repeated. 40 years. It felt like 40 minutes, maybe 40 seconds. He looked at Morgan, and some of that wrongness faded from his eyes, replaced by something like grief. My name is William Prescott. I came here in 1979 and I found a door. It showed me things outside of time, and then it let me go. I don't know why. Mr. Prescott, the others weren't so lucky. William's gaze drifted past Morgan toward the granite walls of the cirque. The ones who went through before me, the ones who went through after. They're still in there. They'll always be in there. Time doesn't work the same way once you step through. He focused on her again, and his eyes were fully human now. Human and terrified. You need to leave. Right now. Before they notice you're here. Before who notices, the aurora pulsed, and the quality of the light changed. Morgan turned, looking for the source of the shift, and felt her blood crystallize into ice. The shadows on the granite walls were moving, not shifting with the changing light, but moving independently, peeling away from the stone and coalescing into shapes that were almost human, almost recognizable. They had faces, dozens of faces, overlapping and merging, expressions frozen in moments of confusion or fear or something worse. The Ijirak, William whispered. That's what the Inuit called them, the in-between ones. They exist in the spaces where time breaks down. They collect people. They've been collecting people here for centuries. He grabbed Morgan's arm with surprising strength. They let me go because they wanted you to find me. They want you to know about the door. They want you to wonder about it. They want you to come back. The shadows were growing larger, more defined. Morgan could hear something now beneath the silence. Whispers, just like William had described. Words in a language that scratched at the inside of her skull. She ran. She dragged William with her, half carrying him across the talus toward the helicopter. The shadows followed, sliding across the rock face with fluid grace, their whispers growing louder. The aurora overhead was pulsing faster now, the rhythm matching Morgan's heartbeat. Or perhaps her heartbeat was matching the rhythm. She couldn't tell anymore. They reached the helicopter. Morgan shoved William into the passenger seat, slammed the door, sprinted around to the pilot's side. Her hands found the controls automatically, muscle memory taking over while her conscious mind screamed at her to go, go, go. The engine caught on the first try. The rotors spun up. The shadow things reached the edge of the landing zone just as the skids left the ground. One of them looked up at her with a face she recognized. Her father. Dead these 11 years. He smiled at her with her father's exact smile and raised one hand in a wave that was both greeting and goodbye. Morgan didn't look back. The storm hit when they were 20 minutes from Bettles, a wall of white that swallowed visibility down to nothing. Morgan flew on instruments alone, her hands steady despite the trembling she couldn't quite control, guiding the helicopter through conditions that should have been beyond her limits. Beside her, William sat in silence, staring out at the whiteout as if he could see something in it that she couldn't. They landed at Bettles as the first real snow began to fall. The local clinic took William in for evaluation, found him in perfect physical health despite 40 years in the wilderness with no apparent sustenance. His wife had died in 1995. His children were older than he was now. The world he'd left had continued without him, and he was a ghost returning to a place that had long since forgotten how to accommodate him. Morgan gave her statement to the National Park Service investigators, told them about the beacon, the cirque, the impossible man in outdated clothing. She didn't mention the shadows, or the whispers, or the face of her dead father. Some things couldn't be put into reports. Some things couldn't be explained to people who hadn't seen them. William Prescott lived for 3 more years. He spent most of that time in a care facility in Fairbanks, unable or unwilling to fully reintegrate into a world that had moved on without him. Morgan visited him once, 6 months after the rescue, and found him staring out the window at the night sky, waiting for the aurora. They're patient, he told her. They showed me what patience really means. Centuries, millennia. Time doesn't touch them the way it touches us. They're still there, in that cirque, in that doorway. They're always there. He turned to look at her, and for just a moment that bottomless depth was back in his eyes. You felt them, didn't you? The whispers? They're not just sounds, they're invitations. And once you've heard them, really heard them, you'll hear them for the rest of your life. In the wind, in the silence, in your dreams. Morgan told herself it wasn't true. She told herself the case was closed. The man was rescued. The mystery was nothing more than a fluke of technology and a mental break brought on by extreme isolation. She told herself these things every night as she lay awake in her cabin in Bettles, listening to the wind howl off the Brooks Range, watching the aurora paint strange patterns on her ceiling. She told herself she wasn't listening for whispers. She told herself she wasn't hearing them. But every year when September comes and the aurora returns, Morgan finds herself looking north toward the Arrogech Peaks. And sometimes, in the pulse and flow of those ancient lights, she sees shapes that might be shadows. She sees patterns that might be language. She sees a doorway standing open in the darkness between stars, waiting for her to finally accept the invitation she's been carrying since that day in the cirque. 40 years felt like 40 seconds, William had said. Morgan is 53 now. She wonders sometimes how long 40 seconds might feel from the other side of that door. She wonders if she'll ever stop wanting to find out. Location: Theodore Roosevelt National Park, North Dakota. Date: November 8, 2003. The cold arrived on the first Monday of November like something with teeth. Morgan Slade stood on the porch of the South Unit Ranger Station and watched the thermometer drop through the 20s, the teens, settling somewhere around 8 degrees by the time the sun crested the Badlands to the east. The wind came straight down from Saskatchewan with nothing to stop it, slicing across the prairie and through the painted buttes with a sound like the earth itself was exhaling. She'd worked Theodore Roosevelt for 11 years now, and the cold still surprised her every autumn. Not its presence, but its absoluteness, the way it turned the landscape into something alien and merciless. She went back inside and poured her second cup of coffee, checking the log from the night patrol. Nothing unusual. A few elk sightings near Peaceful Valley. A report of a vehicle parked after hours at the Painted Canyon overlook. Probably photographers waiting for sunrise. The park was quiet this time of year. The summer crowds had vanished with the warm weather, leaving only the occasional hardy hiker and the wildlife preparing for the brutal months ahead. Bison grazed in the river bottoms, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Mule deer moved through the draws at dawn and dusk, cautious and alert. And somewhere in the backcountry, men with rifles were hunting them. Hunting season had opened on the lands surrounding the park, and every year it brought the same problem. Poachers who didn't recognize or didn't care about the boundaries. Morgan had dealt with them before. Good old boys from Dickinson or Medora who figured a few deer taken from federal land wouldn't matter, wouldn't be noticed, wouldn't hurt anyone. She'd written citations, confiscated weapons, testified in court. She'd heard every excuse, every justification, every muttered curse as she loaded their gear into her truck. She didn't believe in giving warnings anymore. 15 years ago, maybe, when she'd been young and thought people could be reasoned with. Now she knew better. Some men only understood consequences. The morning radio check came through at 7 sharp. Unit 6, this is dispatch. Status report over. Dispatch, Unit 6. All quiet at South Unit. Temperatures dropped to single digits, wind chill below 0. I'm heading out for a boundary patrol along the eastern perimeter. We've had reports of vehicles near the Ma Da Hay Trail access. Over. Copy, Unit 6. Be advised, a rancher called in last night about hearing shots after dark near the Paddock Creek drainage. Could be poaching activity. Over. Understood. I'll check it out. Unit 6 out. Morgan pulled on her thermal layers, then her uniform, then her heaviest parka. She checked her sidearm, her radio, her GPS unit. The cold weather kit went in the truck. Emergency blankets, flares, extra batteries, a thermos of hot coffee, hand warmers. In weather like this, a breakdown could kill you faster than any predator. She paused at the door, looking out at the vast brown expanse of the Badlands. The landscape here was ancient. 70 million years of erosion had carved the buttes and coulees, exposed the coal seams and petrified wood, created a terrain that looked like another planet. Theodore Roosevelt had called it a land of vast silent spaces. Morgan had always loved that description. The silence here was real, physical, a presence you could feel pressing against your ears. But lately, something about the silence felt different, heavier, expectant. She shook off the thought and headed for her truck. Superstition was for people who didn't have work to do. Travis Denton had never liked waiting. He sat in the cab of his Ford F-250, engine running for heat, watching the tree line where Kyle and Ray had disappeared an hour ago. The plan had been simple. Park at the old fire road, hike in before dawn, take a few deer from the river bottom where the herd wintered, and be back across the boundary before any ranger got wise. They'd done it before. Everyone did it. The park was huge and understaffed, and the deer didn't know the difference between federal land and the BLM acres to the east. But Kyle and Ray should have been back by now. The sun was up, the cold was getting worse, and Travis was starting to feel something he didn't want to name. Not fear. Travis Denton didn't get scared. Not of weather, not of game wardens, not of anything that walked or crawled. But something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut, that hunter's instinct that had kept him alive in the North Dakota wilderness for 43 years. He'd heard the shot 20 minutes ago. Just one. That was good. One shot meant a clean kill, meant Kyle or Ray had found their mark. But then nothing. No second shot, no radio call, no sound of them hiking back through the brush. Travis checked his watch. 15 more minutes. Then he'd go looking. The wind picked up, rattling the truck's windows, and Travis caught movement at the edge of his vision. Something in the tree line. A shape. Maybe human. Maybe animal. He squinted through the frost on the glass, trying to make it out. A woman. She was standing at the edge of the cottonwoods, maybe 50 yards away, wearing what looked like a white dress. No coat, no hat, just standing there in the killing cold, watching him. Travis felt his skin prickle. Nobody dressed like that out here. Nobody could survive dressed like that, not in this weather. He reached for his rifle, a Remington 700 that had dropped elk at 300 yards, and stepped out of the truck. "Hey, you okay?" The woman didn't move, didn't respond. The wind whipped her dress around her legs, and Travis noticed something wrong about the way she stood. Too still. Too patient. Like a deer that's spotted you but hasn't decided whether to run. "Ma'am, you need help?" She turned and walked into the trees. Not hurried, not slow. Just a smooth, gliding motion that carried her into the shadows between the cottonwoods and out of sight. Travis stood there for a long moment, his breath steaming in the frozen air, his rifle growing cold in his hands. Then he heard Kyle scream. Morgan found the truck at 9:15. It was parked on an old fire access road that hadn't been maintained in years, half hidden behind a stand of junipers. North Dakota plates. A Remington rifle on the front seat. The action open, unfired. The engine was still warm. She called it in. "Dispatch Unit 6. I've got an abandoned vehicle on the eastern boundary, about 2 miles north of Paddock Creek. Looks like our poachers. One rifle visible, no occupants. I'm going to check the area. Over." "Copy, Unit 6. Exercise caution. Do you need backup?" "Negative. I'll report back in 30. Unit 6 out." Morgan swept the area around the truck, looking for tracks. The ground was frozen hard, but she found boot prints leading into the cottonwood grove that lined the creek bottom. 3 sets, heading east toward the park interior. She followed them, her hand resting on her sidearm, her breath making small clouds that the wind tore apart instantly. The silence was absolute. No birds, no rustle of small animals, no sound at all except the wind and her own footsteps crunching on the frost-hardened grass. Morgan had walked this drainage 100 times. She knew its sounds, the creak of cottonwood branches, the distant call of magpies, the occasional snort of deer moving through the brush. Today there was nothing. The silence pressed against her ears like cotton, muffling even her own thoughts. She found the first body 50 yards into the tree line. Kyle Birch, she'd learn his name later, from the ID in his wallet, was lying face down in a frozen creek bed. His rifle was beside him, unfired. His body showed no obvious wounds, no blood, no sign of struggle. But his face, when Morgan knelt to check for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find, was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Eyes wide, mouth open, every muscle locked in a rictus of fear. And his legs were broken. Both of them shattered below the knee, bent at angles that made Morgan's stomach clench. The breaks were violent, catastrophic. The kind of damage you'd see from a high-speed car accident, not a fall in the woods. She keyed her radio with hands that weren't quite steady. "Dispatch Unit 6, I have a body. Male, maybe early 30s, deceased. Looks like... I'm not sure what it looks like. I need medical and law enforcement backup at my location. Over. Copy, Unit 6. Backup en route. ETA 45 minutes. Can you confirm cause of death? Morgan looked at the shattered legs, the face frozen in terror, the pristine snow around the body with no tracks except her own and the dead man's. Negative, dispatch. Cause unknown. I'm continuing the search. There may be more victims. She found the second body 200 yards further in. Ray Womack had made it further than his friend, but not by much. He was slumped against a cottonwood, his arms wrapped around the trunk as if he'd been trying to climb it. His legs were broken too, the same catastrophic damage, bones splintered through the fabric of his jeans. His rifle was gone. His face held the same expression of frozen terror. But there was something else. Something that made Morgan stop, her breath catching in her throat. Hoofprints. They circled the body in a pattern that made no sense. Deer tracks, clearly, the distinctive split hoof impression of a whitetail, but arranged in a way that suggested something walking on 2 legs rather than 4. The prints came from nowhere, circled the body 3 times and then vanished. No trail leading in, no trail leading out. Just the perfect circle of hoofprints in the frost and the dead man at its center. Morgan had seen a lot in 11 years. She'd found hypothermia victims, heart attack victims, people who'd fallen from cliffs or been gored by bison. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to do the job, to save the feelings for later. But standing in that frozen creek bottom, looking at those impossible hoofprints, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Something ancient and primal, a fear that came from somewhere deeper than thought. She backed away slowly, her hand on her weapon, her eyes scanning the tree line. Something was watching her. She could feel it. Travis Denton was running. He'd found Kyle first, followed the screams through the cottonwoods until he'd burst into that creek bed and seen his friend lying there, legs bent wrong, face locked in a scream that would never end. He'd called for Ray, gotten no answer, and then he'd seen her, the woman in white, standing at the edge of the trees watching him, closer now than before, close enough that he could see her face, beautiful, heartbreakingly beautiful, with dark eyes and dark hair and skin that seemed to glow in the gray morning light, close enough that he could see her feet. They weren't feet. They were hooves, black and cloven, like a deer's, sunk into the frozen earth as if she weighed nothing at all. Travis had run, dropped his rifle, abandoned his friends, and run like he hadn't run since high school football, crashing through the brush toward the truck, toward safety, toward anything that wasn't those eyes watching him with patient, ancient hunger. But the landscape kept changing. He should have reached the truck by now, should have burst out of the trees into the clearing where he'd parked. Instead, he found himself in another creek bottom, another stand of cottonwoods, another frozen ravine that looked exactly like the one he'd just left. He'd doubled back somehow, gotten turned around. The cold was getting to him, slowing his thoughts, making everything fuzzy at the edges. He stopped gasping, his lungs burning in the frozen air, tried to get his bearings. The sun was there to the east, which meant the truck should be... Travis. The voice came from behind him, a woman's voice, soft and sweet, like honey poured over broken glass. He turned. She was standing 10 feet away. The white dress rippled in the wind, but she didn't seem to feel the cold. Her dark eyes held his, and in them Travis saw something that emptied his mind of everything except the desperate animal need to flee. "You came to take what isn't yours," she said. Her voice carried perfectly despite the wind, as if she were speaking directly into his ear. "You came to kill on sacred ground." I don't... 3 seasons ago, you took a doe and her fawn from the river bottom." She took a step forward. Her hooves made no sound on the frozen ground. 2 seasons ago, you took a buck who had sired 17 children. Last season, you took a pregnant doe. I watched you field dress her. I watched you laugh." Travis's legs wouldn't move. His whole body felt locked, frozen, not from the cold but from something deeper. A paralysis that came from the hind brain, from the part of him that remembered what it meant to be prey. Please. The word came out as a whisper. Please, I'll never come back. I swear to God, your God has no power here. She was close now, close enough to touch. And Travis understood in the last clear moment of his life that he wasn't going to die because he'd hunted deer. He was going to die because of the other things. The waitress in Bowman he'd followed to her car. The woman at the bar in Dickinson he'd cornered in the parking lot. The wife who'd finally stopped going to the hospital because the questions were too hard to answer. The deer woman knew. She had always known. Close your eyes, she said, and her voice was almost gentle now. Travis closed his eyes. Morgan found the third body at the base of a sandstone outcropping, 2 miles deeper into the park than any of the poachers should have been able to travel on foot. Travis Denton's legs were shattered like the others, but his face was different. Not terror. Something that looked almost like peace. The hoofprints were everywhere, circling the body, leading up the cliff face, covering every inch of ground in patterns that hurt to look at, spirals and whirls and shapes that seemed to shift when Morgan tried to focus on them. She didn't touch anything. She stood at the edge of the scene and waited for backup. Her radio in one hand, her weapon in the other. Her eyes fixed on the tree line where something stood watching her. She couldn't see it clearly. Just a shape, white against the brown and gray of the Badlands there at the corner of her vision and gone when she turned to look. But she knew it was there. She could feel its attention like a weight on her skin, ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. Her radio crackled. Unit 6, backup is 5 minutes out. What's your status? Morgan keyed the mic. Her voice came out steady, professional, the voice of an 11-year veteran who didn't believe in ghost stories. 3 victims confirmed, all deceased. Cause of death appears to be... She paused. What could she possibly say? Blunt force trauma to the lower extremities. No sign of the perpetrator. Scene is secured. Copy, Unit 6. Hold position. Morgan held position. The shape in the tree line held its position too, watching, waiting, as patient as the ancient land itself. When the backup arrived, 2 deputies from Billings County and a ranger from the North Unit, Morgan walked them through the scene. She showed them the bodies, the hoofprints, the impossible evidence of something that couldn't exist. She watched their faces cycle through the same emotions she'd felt. Confusion, then unease, then the slow dawning of something that might have been fear. None of them said it out loud. None of them had the words. But as they loaded the bodies into the coroner's van and began the long process of documentation and investigation, old Harlan Whitecalf from the Standing Rock Reservation arrived with the medical examiner. He was a consultant the Park Service used sometimes, an expert in local history and traditions. He walked the scene slowly, his weathered face unreadable, and when he was finished, he came to stand beside Morgan at the edge of the crime scene tape. "You saw her," he said. It wasn't a question. Morgan didn't answer. She didn't need to. "My grandmother used to tell stories." Harlan's voice was quiet, meant only for her. "About a woman who walks the plains. Beautiful, irresistible. But if you look at her feet..." He shook his head slowly. "She comes from men who take without asking. Men who think the world belongs to them. Men who hunt what shouldn't be hunted. That's not possible." "No," Harlan agreed. "It isn't." He looked out at the Badlands, at the painted buttes and the river bottoms and the vast silent spaces where something ancient still walked. "But she doesn't care much about what's possible." The official report listed the cause of death as undetermined traumatic injury, circumstances under investigation. The case remained open for 6 years before being quietly closed due to lack of evidence. No suspects were ever identified. No charges were ever filed. Morgan Slade continued working at Theodore Roosevelt for another decade, eventually rising to district ranger before her retirement in 2018. She never spoke publicly about what she'd seen that November morning. She never filed a report that included the hoofprints, the woman in white, the shape watching from the tree line. Some things didn't fit in official documents. Some things lived in the spaces between what was real and what was impossible. But she changed her patrols after that day. She made a point of visiting the Paddock Creek drainage every few weeks. leaving small offerings at the base of the cottonwoods. Tobacco, sweet grass, things Harlan Whitecalf had taught her. She wasn't sure if it mattered. She wasn't sure if anything she did could matter to something that ancient, that patient, that certain in its purpose. The poaching dropped off in the years that followed. Word spread through the hunting community, not officially, never officially, but in the way that warnings always spread in small communities. Stay out of Theodore Roosevelt. Something lives there, something that remembers. Morgan didn't believe in ghost stories. She told herself that for 40 years, through a career that had shown her every way the wilderness could kill, but every November when the first real cold swept down from Canada and the Badlands went silent in that heavy, expectant way, Morgan found herself scanning the tree lines, looking for a shape in white, looking for hoofprints in the frost, and sometimes, in the corner of her vision, she thought she saw her, the woman who walked the plains, the guardian who remembered every trespass, every violation, every act of predation by men who thought the world belonged to them, still watching, still waiting, still keeping count. Location: Haleakala National Park, Maui, Hawaii. Date: August 23, 2019. The House of the Sun slept beneath 10,000 stars. Kailani Akana stood at the summit overlook, her breath forming small clouds in the 38-degree air, watching the Milky Way arc across the sky like a river of light. At 10,023 feet, Haleakala's summit existed above the clouds, above the humidity, above everything that made Hawaii feel like Hawaii. Up here, the tropical island fell away and you stood on something older, a volcanic crater 3,000 feet deep and 7 miles across, its floor a moonscape of cinder cones and ancient lava flows that the Hawaiians had walked for centuries before the telescopes came. Her grandmother had told her stories about this place, how the demigod Maui had lassoed the sun here, slowing its journey across the sky to give his mother more daylight to dry her kapa cloth, how the crater was sacred, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors grew thin, how some nights, if you were foolish enough to be on the mountain after dark, you might hear the drums. Kailani checked her watch. 2:47 a.m. Her shift at the summit visitor station ran from midnight to 8, monitoring the road conditions and providing emergency response for the handful of tourists who came for sunrise viewing and the astronomers who worked through the night at the various observatory facilities. Most nights were quiet, checking on the locked gates, making radio contact with the observatories, watching meteors streak across the unpolluted sky. She'd worked this post for 4 years, ever since returning to Maui after college on the mainland, and she'd grown to love the solitude, the silence, the feeling of standing at the roof of her island while the rest of the world slept far below. She walked back to the ranger station, a small building huddled against the wind that could reach hurricane force on the exposed summit. Inside, she poured herself coffee from the thermos she'd brought, Kona because some traditions were worth maintaining, and settled into the worn office chair to review the night's logs. 2 vehicles had come up for stargazing, both departed by midnight. The University of Hawaii's telescope facility had 3 researchers working tonight, conducting spectroscopic observations of some distant galaxy. The other observatories were automated, their domes rotating silently to track objects invisible to the naked eye. Her radio crackled. "Summit Station, this is UH Observatory. Radio check." Kailani keyed the mic. UH Observatory, Summit Station copies. "How's the seeing tonight?" "Crystal clear, some of the best conditions we've had all month. We'll be running until astronomical twilight, around 5:15. "Copy that. Give me a shout if you need anything." She set down the radio and pulled up the weather report on the station computer. Clear skies, light winds, temperature dropping to near freezing by dawn. Perfect conditions for observation, both astronomical and otherwise. The thought came unbidden, carrying her grandmother's voice. "Some nights the marchers walk. You'll know when they come. Everyone knows. The only question is whether you're smart enough to look away." Kailani shook off the memory. She was a park ranger, a professional. She didn't believe in ghost stories, no matter how many of them she'd grown up hearing. The night marchers were cultural tradition, important to preserve and respect, but they weren't real, couldn't be real. And yet, her grandmother had seen them once, as a young woman walking alone on the Old King's Trail near Kona. She'd heard the drums first, distant, rhythmic, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Then the torches, flickering between the trees. She'd thrown herself to the ground, pressed her face into the earth, and prayed to ancestors she barely remembered. The procession had passed so close she could feel the heat of their torches on her back, smell the oil burning, hear the rustle of their kappa cloth and the whisper of bare feet on stone. When she finally raised her head, the trail was empty, and dawn was breaking. She never walked alone at night again. Kalani finished her coffee and began her 3 a.m. perimeter check, stepping back out into the cold, clear darkness. The stars blazed overhead, undimmed by any artificial light. The crater spread below her, vast and black, its floor invisible in the darkness but present nonetheless. She could feel its emptiness, its depth, the way it pulled at something deep in her chest. She was walking the path toward the overlook when she heard it. Drums. Faint, impossibly faint, but unmistakable. A steady rhythm coming from somewhere in the crater below. Pahu drums. The kind her great-uncle had played at ceremonies when she was small. The kind that hadn't been made in the traditional way for generations. Kailani stopped. Her hand found her radio by instinct, but she didn't key it. What would she say? I hear drums? They would think she was crazy. They would be right to think it. The drumming grew slightly louder, joined by something else. Chanting, low and resonant. The words unclear, but the cadence unmistakable. Ali, ancient Hawaiian prayer chants, the kind her grandmother had sung at family funerals, the kind that were only performed for sacred purposes. And then she saw the lights. Torches. A line of them, moving along the crater floor, winding between the cinder cones in a procession that stretched back into the darkness. From this distance they looked like fireflies, small and flickering, but they moved with purpose, with formation, following a path that no marked trail covered. Kailani's blood turned to ice. She knew what this was. Every Hawaiian child knew. The Huakai Po, the night marchers, the spirits of ancient warriors walking their eternal paths between the sacred sites, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. She also knew the rules. Don't look directly at them. Don't let them see you watching. Lie flat, face down, and pray. If you have an ancestor among them, they may claim you as Ohana and spare your life. If not, her radio crackled, shattering the spell. Summit Station, this is UH Observatory. We're seeing something strange. There are lights in the crater, looks like a group of people with torches. Can you confirm? Kailani grabbed the radio, her hands trembling. UH Observatory, Summit Station. I see them. Do not... She stopped. Do not what? Do not look? How could she tell a scientist not to look? Say again, Summit Station. Negative on identification. Possibly hikers who ignored the closure signs. I'll investigate. Copy that. Keep us posted. Dr. Marsh is getting some footage through the telescope. Fascinating thermal signatures. Kailani's stomach dropped. Tell Dr. Marsh to stop. Tell him not to look at them directly. A pause. Then, confused. Say again. But Kailani was already running. Doctor. Stephen Marsh had spent 30 years looking at the sky, and he'd never seen anything like this. The procession was clearly visible through the telescope's camera feed, a line of heat signatures moving across the crater floor, each one roughly human-sized, each one carrying what appeared to be a secondary heat source. Torches, presumably, though the temperature readings were wrong. Too hot. Far too hot for any conventional fire. He adjusted the focus, trying to get a clearer image. The thermal camera wasn't designed for this kind of close-range observation, but the resolution was improving as he fine-tuned the settings. He could make out individual figures now, walking in formation, some carrying what looked like weapons. They were carrying weapons, spears, clubs, objects that had no place in the modern world. Are you getting this? He called to his colleagues, Dr. Chen and Dr. Yamamoto, who were reviewing spectroscopic data at the main console. Getting what? Dr. Chen asked without looking up. There's a procession in the crater. Dozens of people, maybe more, with torches and I think they're dressed in traditional Hawaiian clothing. Some kind of cultural ceremony. Dr. Chen turned, her brow furrowed. At 3 a.m.? In a closed area? That doesn't sound right. I'm telling you, look at this feed. They gathered around his monitor, watching the line of figures move across the crater floor. The thermal signatures were clear, undeniable, but something about them was wrong. The heat patterns didn't match living human bodies. They were too uniform, too consistent, lacking the normal variations that came from breathing, movement, circulation. That's got to be a glitch, Dr. Yamamoto said. No one's body temperature is that stable. I'm going to try the visible light camera, Stephen said, reaching for the controls. Get an actual image of what we're dealing with. Should we call the ranger? Dr. Chen asked. Already did. She's looking into it. The visible light camera rotated into position. Stephen adjusted the exposure for the darkness, boosting the ISO, widening the aperture. The image that appeared on his monitor made no sense. The crater floor was empty. No torches, no figures, nothing. But the thermal camera still showed them, clear as day. A procession of heat signatures marching along the ancient volcanic landscape. That's impossible, Dr. Yamamoto whispered. If they're giving off heat, they should be visible. Light is light. Stephen switched between cameras back and forth. Thermal, procession of figures. Visible, empty crater. Thermal, figures with torches. Visible, nothing but rock and shadow. I'm going outside, he said, pushing back from the console. I need to see this with my own eyes. Stephen, wait. But he was already moving toward the dome's exterior access door. The procession was heading northwest toward the far rim of the crater. If he climbed to the observation platform, he might be able to see them directly, might be able to understand what was actually happening. The door opened onto cold, thin air. Stephen stepped out onto the metal grating of the platform, 10,000 feet above sea level, and looked down into the crater. He could hear them now, drums, low and insistent, echoing off the crater walls, chanting in a language he didn't understand but somehow recognized the rhythm of it, the cadence older than English, older than anything he knew. And there, moving along the crater floor, he could see the torches, flickering. Real, undeniably real. He raised the telescope's finder scope to his eye, wanting a closer look. The procession filled his vision. Warriors in feathered capes carrying spears and leo mano edged with shark teeth, their faces painted, their expressions set in grim determination. They marched in perfect formation, their feet raising no dust, their torches casting light that somehow failed to illuminate the ground around them. One of them turned and looked directly at him. Stephen froze. The figure, a massive man with a crested helmet and a cape the color of dried blood, had stopped walking. The others continued past him, but he stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the observatory platform, on the telescope, on Stephen. And then he smiled. It was not a human smile. It was something older, something that had forgotten what smiling meant and only remembered the shape of it. A smile that promised nothing good. The drums stopped. The chanting stopped. In the sudden silence, Stephen heard a voice, inside his head, not through his ears, speaking words he understood despite never having learned the language. E hele mai. Come, walk with us. His hand moved toward the railing without his permission. His foot lifted, ready to step over, ready to climb down the 3,000 feet into the crater, ready to join the procession that waited for him below. Dr. Marsh! A hand grabbed his arm, yanking him back. He stumbled, the finder scope falling from his grip, clattering on the metal platform. He turned to see a woman in a park ranger uniform, her face tight with fear, her grip on his arm strong enough to bruise. Don't look at them, she said. Whatever you do, don't look. I know. Her voice cracked. I know you did. We need to get inside. Now." She pulled him toward the door, and Stephen followed, his legs moving on their own, his mind still echoing with that voice. "Ehelemai, come, walk with us." Behind them, the drums began again. Kailani got Dr. Marsh inside and slammed the door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The astronomer was pale, shaking, his eyes unfocused and strange. "What did you see?" she demanded. "Exactly what did you see?" "Warriors," he said slowly, as if remembering a dream. "Hawaiian warriors, I think, with torches and weapons. They were marching through the crater. And one of them..." He stopped, his hand moving to his temple. "One of them looked at me." Kailani closed her eyes. She knew what that meant. Her grandmother had been clear about the rules, passed down through generations. If they see you, they claim you. Your spirit walks with them forever, marching between the worlds until time itself ends. Did you look away? No. I looked right at him, through the telescope. I saw his face. How long? I don't know. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like... He trailed off, his eyes going distant again. It felt like he was inside my head. Dr. Chen and Dr. Yamamoto were staring at them, their faces pale with confusion and fear. "What's going on?" Dr. Chen asked. "Stephen, what happened out there?" "Everyone needs to stay inside," Kailani said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And away from the windows. Don't look at the crater. Don't look at any lights you might see. And if you hear drums..." The lights went out. Not just the observatory lights. Everything. The computers, the equipment, the emergency lighting that should have kicked in automatically. Total darkness. Absolute and complete. Pressing against them like something solid. And in that darkness, Kailani heard footsteps on the metal stairs outside the dome. Heavy footsteps climbing slowly, deliberately. Many of them. "They're coming," Dr. Marsh whispered. "They're coming for me." "Nobody move," Kailani said. "Nobody speak." The footsteps reached the platform. Stopped outside the door. Knock, knock, knock. 3 beats, heavy and deliberate, shaking the metal frame. Then a voice. Not through the door, but somehow inside the room, inside their heads, speaking in Hawaiian. "He looked upon us. He belongs to us now. Send him out, or we will come in." "Oh God," Dr. Yamamoto breathed. "Oh God, oh God." "Don't answer," Kailani whispered. "Don't. Send him out." The door shuddered. The hinges groaned. Whatever was on the other side was pushing, testing, patient but inevitable. Kailani grabbed Dr. Marsh's arm. "Come with me. Back door, now." "What?" "There's another exit, service corridor. If we can get you to the ranger station, get you off the mountain before dawn." "They won't stop," he said, his voice hollow. "You know that. You know what I did, what I saw. They won't ever stop." The door groaned again, louder this time. Something cracked, one of the hinges giving way. Kailani made her decision. She pulled Dr. Marsh toward the back of the dome, toward the narrow service door that led to the maintenance corridor. Behind them, the main door burst open with a sound like thunder, and the room filled with light. Torchlight, flickering in orange, casting shadows that moved wrong, that bent in directions shadows shouldn't bend. She didn't look back. She couldn't look back. But she heard them enter, heard the footsteps, dozens of them, filling the room. Heard Dr. Chen scream, a short, sharp sound cut off mid-breath. Heard Dr. Yamamoto praying in Japanese, the words tumbling over each other in desperate speed. Then silence. Kailani reached the service door, yanked it open, pushed Dr. Marsh through. The corridor beyond was dark but empty, leading to the secondary exit on the far side of the dome. She could see starlight at the end. The door was open, the sky beyond untouched by whatever was happening inside. "Run," she said. "Don't stop. Don't look back. Get to the station, get in the truck, drive down the mountain. Don't stop until you reach the ocean. Water breaks the..." What about you? I'm right behind you, go. He ran. Kaylani turned back toward the door she'd come through and found herself face to face with a warrior. He stood in the doorway, blocking the torchlight behind him, his silhouette massive and impossibly still. She could see the outline of his helmet, the feathers rising from its crest, the cape that hung to his ankles. She could smell burning oil and something else, something older, like the volcanic rock itself. She dropped to her knees, pressed her face to the floor, and began to chant. Not the prayers of the church she'd attended growing up, but the older prayers, the ones her grandmother had taught her, the ones that called upon ancestors she'd never met to claim her as family, to spare her from the endless march. The warrior stood over her. She could feel his presence, the weight of centuries pressing down on her spine. Then she heard another voice, a woman's voice, familiar somehow, speaking in Hawaiian. This one is mine. She carries my blood. Leave her. Silence. Footsteps. Gone. When Kaylani finally raised her head, the corridor was empty. The torchlight had faded. The drums had stopped. Through the open door at the end of the corridor, she could see the first pale light of dawn touching the eastern sky. She pushed herself to her feet and ran. Dr. Stephen Marsh was found 3 days later, walking along the King's Trail near the base of Haleakala, 40 miles from where Kaylani had last seen him. He was dehydrated, sunburned, and unable to explain how he'd traveled that distance on foot in less than 72 hours. He had no memory of the journey, only of drums, endless drums, and the feeling of walking through darkness that had no end. The bodies of Dr. Chen and Dr. Yamamoto were never found. The official report listed them as missing persons, presumed victims of a fall into the crater during the power outage that had affected the observatory that night. The cause of the outage was never determined. Kaylani Akana submitted her incident report with the minimum required detail. Power outage at approximately 3:15 a.m. 2 observatory personnel missing following structural failure of primary access door. 1 personnel recovered alive. No explanation for events. She did not mention the drums. She did not mention the torches. She did not mention the voice that had spoken in the darkness, claiming her as Ohana, protecting her with blood ties that stretched back generations. She did not mention the procession she had seen, just before dawn, moving along the crater's rim toward the eastern sky. Dozens of figures, warriors and priests and chiefs who had walked these paths for centuries before she was born. Among them, 2 new figures walked. A woman in modern hiking clothes, a man in a lab coat, their faces blank, their eyes fixed forward, their feet moving in eternal rhythm. Dr. Marsh resigned from the university a month later. He moved to Kansas, he told his colleagues, somewhere flat, somewhere without mountains or craters or sacred places, somewhere the old things didn't walk. But some nights, he still hears drums, wakes to the sound of chanting in a language he shouldn't understand but somehow does, feels his feet aching as if he's been walking for hours, though he's never left his bed. The night marchers claimed him that night on Haleakala. Whether or not they took his body, part of him is still walking, will always be walking, following that endless procession through the darkness between worlds. E hele mai. Come. Walk with us. On Maui, Kaylani Akana still works the summit station at Haleakala. She has never requested a transfer, never considered leaving the island of her birth. Some things, she believes, require witnesses. Someone has to know what walks these mountains. Someone has to remember the rules. On nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries the faint sound of drums, she turns off her lights and faces east. She doesn't look toward the crater, doesn't watch for torches, just waits and listens and says a quiet prayer of thanks to the grandmother she never got to thank in life. The woman whose voice she heard in that corridor, whose blood runs in her veins, whose spirit walks among the marchers and watches over her still. The boundary between worlds is thin on Haleakala. The old ones remember, and they are always, always watching. Location: Kobuk Valley National Park, Alaska. Date: September 24th, 2016. On the last supply plane had come 3 weeks ago. Ryan Caldwell stood at the window of the Onion Portage Ranger Station and watched the sky turn colors that had no names, salmon and rust, and a deep bruised purple that spread from the eastern horizon like a stain. September in Kobuk Valley meant the death of light. Each day the sun rose a little later, set a little earlier, and the quality of the illumination itself seemed to thin, as if the world were slowly being drained of something essential. In another month, the darkness would be nearly complete. In another month, Ryan would be gone, evacuated to Fairbanks for the winter like every other seasonal employee, leaving the park to the caribou and the wolves and the vast, indifferent silence of the Arctic. But that was a month away. For now, he was alone. Kobuk Valley was not a park that welcomed visitors. There were no roads leading in, no trails to follow, no campgrounds or visitor centers or gift shops selling postcards. The only way to reach it was by bush plane, landing on gravel bars or frozen rivers. And the only people who came were those with specific purposes: researchers studying the caribou migration, archaeologists excavating the ancient hunting sites at Onion Portage, the occasional extreme wilderness enthusiast who wanted to say they'd been somewhere truly remote. In a typical year, fewer than 15,000 people visited. Most days, Ryan saw no one at all. He'd requested this posting. After 12 years with the Park Service, Yosemite, then Yellowstone, then a brutal stint in the Everglades that had ended with a divorce and a prescription for sleeping pills, he'd wanted somewhere quiet. Somewhere the silence could settle into his bones and maybe, finally, wash away the noise that had accumulated over a lifetime of other people's emergencies. Kobuk Valley had delivered. The silence here was absolute in a way that defied description. No traffic, no aircraft, no distant hum of civilization, just the wind across the tundra, the occasional call of a raven, and the sound of his own breathing in the small hours of the night when sleep refused to come. Ryan made his morning coffee and checked the satellite phone as he did every day. The battery was full, the signal strong, his lifeline to the outside world, the thin electronic thread that connected this outpost to the district office in Kotzebue, 60 miles to the west. He'd check in at noon, report nothing to report, and go back to waiting for the season to end. The morning weather reading showed temperatures in the low 30s, winds out of the north at 15 miles per hour, barometric pressure falling. A front was moving in, the first real snow of the season maybe, the white curtain that would eventually seal the park until spring. Ryan noted the readings in his log and pulled on his layers for the morning patrol. The tundra stretched out in every direction, endless and empty, the ground cover turned to gold and rust by the dying year. In the distance, the great Kobuk sand dunes rose against the sky, an impossible landscape, Arctic desert surrounded by boreal forest, created by ancient glaciers grinding rock to powder over millennia. Ryan had walked those dunes a dozen times. They never felt real. Nothing here felt entirely real. He was 2 hours into his patrol when he saw the tent. It was pitched in a small depression near the Kobuk River, a bright orange dome that stood out against the muted colors of the tundra like a wound. Ryan approached carefully, calling out as he walked, "Hello? Park Service." No response. The tent flap was zipped shut. No movement inside, no sound except the wind. Ryan checked his records. He'd logged 2 visitors arriving by bush plane on September 11th. Greg and Megan Sutter, a married couple from Anchorage, experienced backcountry hikers planning a 2-week trek to the dunes and back. They'd been scheduled for pickup on September 25th, tomorrow. But something was wrong. The tent was in the right general area for their planned route, but it was set up poorly, the rain fly loose and flapping, one of the stakes pulled free from the frozen ground, and there were no tracks around it. No boot prints, no signs of recent activity. Just the tent, sitting in the middle of the empty tundra like it had been there forever. "Mr. Sutter? Mrs. Sutter?" Ryan unzipped the tent flap and looked inside. Empty. Sleeping bag still in place, a camp stove, some freeze-dried food packets. 2 backpacks leaning against the tent wall. Everything present and accounted for. Everything suggesting the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and would be right back. Except for the frost. A thin layer of ice crystals coated the inside of the tent, the sleeping bags, the gear. This camp hadn't been occupied in days, maybe longer. Ryan keyed his satellite phone. Kotzebue Base, this is Kobuk Station. I've got an abandoned camp near the river, approximately 4 miles east of Onion Portage. 2 registered visitors unaccounted for. I'm initiating a search. Over. The response came through scratchy but clear. Copy, Kobuk Station. Do you need air support? Ryan looked at the sky. The clouds were thickening, the light already fading, though it was barely past noon. Negative on air support, weather's closing in. I'll search the immediate area and report back at 1800, over. Understood. Keep us posted. Kotzebue out. Ryan began walking a search pattern around the camp, spiraling outward, looking for any sign of which direction the Sutters might have gone. He found nothing. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no dropped equipment. It was as if they'd simply ceased to exist. He was about to widen his search when he heard the voice. Ryan. He spun. There was no one there. Just the empty tundra, the abandoned tent, the wind. Ryan, we're here. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind, seeming to originate from inside his own skull. A man's voice, he thought. Maybe. Mr. Sutter? Greg? Silence. Then from somewhere to the north. We came back. We're here now. We came back. Ryan started walking toward the voice. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in search and rescue protocols and wilderness survival, told him to mark his position, report his heading, proceed with caution. But something else, something deeper, something that had been listening to the silence of Kobuk Valley for too long, simply walked, following the voice into the endless tundra. Megan Sutter had known they were lost by the 3rd day. It wasn't the kind of loss that could be fixed with a compass and a map. She'd checked both repeatedly, and they told her she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The landmarks matched. The river was where it should be. The dunes were visible on the horizon, right where they'd been since they started walking. But the distances were wrong. They'd been walking toward the dunes for 3 days now, and they never got any closer. Every morning the dunes were the same size on the horizon, the same hazy shapes against the sky. Every evening they made camp in what felt like exactly the same place, surrounded by the same undifferentiated tundra, the same golden grass, the same infinite emptiness. Greg wouldn't admit it. Greg had done this trek before 5 years ago, and he kept insisting they were on track, they were making good time. They'd reach the dunes by tomorrow. But Megan saw the way his eyes kept flicking to the compass, the way his voice got tight when she asked how much further. On the 4th night she saw them for the first time. Figures on the horizon. 3 of them, maybe 4, standing motionless against the darkening sky, too far away to make out details, but clearly human-shaped. Other hikers, she thought at first, and her heart leaped with relief. Other people meant help, meant directions, meant confirmation that they hadn't somehow wandered into a place that existed outside the normal rules of geography. She called out, waved her arms. The figures didn't respond. They just stood there, watching, their silhouettes perfectly still against the dying light. Greg, look. He turned, squinting at the horizon. What am I looking at? The people, right there, maybe half a mile out. Greg stared for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. Meg, there's no one there. She looked again. The figures were gone. The horizon was empty, just tundra and sky and the fading light. That night, Megan dreamed of faces. Faces that shifted and blurred when she tried to focus on them. Features that rearranged themselves like reflections in disturbed water. The faces spoke to her in a language she almost understood, words that dissolved into static whenever she tried to grasp their meaning. And behind the faces, behind everything, she sensed a vast empty space. Not darkness, not void, but absence. A place where things that had never existed went to wait. She woke with Greg's name on her lips and didn't know why. By the 6th day, Megan had stopped checking the map. The map was lying. The compass was lying. Everything was lying, except the growing certainty in her gut that they were never going to reach the dunes, never going to reach the pickup point. never going to see another human being again. Unless you counted the figures. They appeared every evening now, standing at the edge of sight watching. Sometimes 3, sometimes 7, sometimes a number that seemed to change when Megan tried to count them. Greg still couldn't see them. Greg was starting to look at her with an expression she recognized from the mirror. The look of someone trying to hold on to sanity with both hands and feeling it slip away regardless. On the 7th night, one of the figures came closer. It walked out of the darkness while Greg slept, approaching the tent with slow, deliberate steps that made no sound on the frozen ground. Megan watched through the mesh window, paralyzed, unable to scream, unable to move, as the figure stopped perhaps 10 feet from where she lay. It was human-shaped. Almost. The proportions were close: arms, legs, torso, head, but something about the geometry was wrong. The angles not quite matching up, the limbs bending in ways that suggested joints in places joints shouldn't be. And the face. The face was her own. It wore her features like a mask that didn't quite fit, stretched over something that wasn't a face at all. Her eyes but too wide set. Her mouth, but the lips too thin, too long, curving up at the edges in a smile that no human muscle could produce. It spoke, and the voice was her voice, and the words were in no language she had ever heard. Then it reached for the tent. Ryan found them on the banks of the Kobuk River, 3 miles from the abandoned camp. They were sitting on a gravel bar side by side staring at the water. They didn't look up when he called out, didn't respond when he approached. They just sat there, motionless, like statues someone had placed in the wilderness as a joke. "Mr. and Mrs. Sutter, I'm Ranger Caldwell. We've been looking for you." Greg Sutter turned his head. The motion was wrong. Too slow, too smooth, like something that had learned the idea of turning, but hadn't quite mastered the execution. His face was blank, expressionless, his eyes fixed on Ryan without seeming to see him. "We came back," he said. His voice was flat, affectless, each word pronounced with careful precision. "We went away and we came back." "Where did you go? What happened to you?" Megan turned now, the same wrong motion, the same blank expression. "We were walking," she said. "We walked for a very long time, and then we stopped walking. And then we came back." Ryan felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Something was wrong here. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, in a way he couldn't articulate but could feel in his bones, in the primitive hindbrain that remembered what it meant to be prey. "Okay," he said, keeping his voice calm, professional. "Let's get you back to the station. You've been out here for almost 2 weeks. You need food, water, medical attention." "We don't need anything," Greg said. "We're here now. We came back." "We wanted to come back," Megan added. "We remembered this place. We remembered wanting to be here. So we came back." They stood in unison, the same motion at the same moment, like puppets controlled by a single hand. Their movements were smooth, coordinated, perfect, and utterly inhuman. Ryan took a step backward. His hand found the grip of his sidearm, though he didn't draw it. What would he shoot? 2 lost hikers. 2 people who were standing right in front of him speaking English, wearing the same clothes they'd been wearing when they landed 2 weeks ago. But they weren't the same. He knew it with a certainty that transcended evidence. The people standing in front of him looked like Greg and Megan Sutter, sounded like them, had their identification, their gear, their wedding rings. But something behind their eyes was wrong. Something fundamental had been replaced or removed or rearranged, and what remained was a shell, a mask, a hollow approximation of humanity worn by something that had never been human at all. "The station's this way," Ryan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Follow me." They followed. Their footsteps made no sound on the frozen ground. The satellite phone wouldn't connect. Ryan had tried 6 times, each attempt met with static and silence. The battery was full. The signal indicator showed strong reception, but every time he keyed the transmission, the line went dead. The Sutters sat at the table in the ranger station, watching him with those blank, empty eyes. They hadn't spoken since they'd arrived. hadn't asked for food or water, hadn't moved at all, except to sit down in perfect unison when Ryan gestured toward the chairs. "I'm going to try the emergency beacon," Ryan said, more to himself than to them. "We'll have a plane here by morning." "There's no plane coming," Greg said. His voice was different now, layered somehow as if multiple voices were speaking the same words in almost perfect synchronization. "The plane isn't real anymore. The station isn't real. You're not real." "You're the only real thing left," Megan added in that same layered voice. "You and us. And we're not sure about us." Ryan's hand found his sidearm again. This time he drew it, holding it at his side, barrel pointed at the floor. "What happened to you out there? What did you see?" The Sutters looked at each other. The motion was perfect, mirrored. Two bodies controlled by a single will. "We saw the place between places," Greg said. "The space where things go when they stop being real." "We saw the ones who live there," Megan said. "They have so many faces. They collect them. They collected ours. But we remembered wanting to come back. We remembered this place, this station, this man with the gun who asked us questions. So they let us come back. They wanted us to come back. They wanted to see what would happen." Ryan raised the weapon. His hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that he couldn't control. "What are you?" The Sutters smiled. The expression was identical on both faces, stretching their mouths too wide, showing too many teeth, curving their lips at angles that human faces weren't designed to achieve. "We're Greg and Megan Sutter," they said in unison, their voices merging into something that wasn't a voice at all, just a sound wearing the shape of words. "We came back. We're here now." They stood. "And now you're going to come with us." The search team found Ryan Caldwell 3 days later, sitting on the steps of the Onion Portage Ranger Station, staring at nothing. He didn't respond to their calls, didn't react when they touched his shoulder, didn't seem to register their presence at all. The station was empty. No sign of the Sutters, no sign of struggle, no sign of anything unusual except for the satellite phone, which lay on the floor with its battery removed and its casing cracked as if someone had tried to destroy it with their bare hands. Ryan was airlifted to Fairbanks, then to Anchorage, where he spent 6 weeks in a psychiatric facility. The official diagnosis was acute dissociative disorder brought on by extended isolation. He didn't argue with the diagnosis. He didn't say anything at all, not for the first 3 weeks. When he finally started talking, he only said one thing, over and over in a voice that the nurses said didn't quite sound like his voice anymore. They came back. But they weren't the same. They came back, but they weren't the same. They came back. They came back. They came back. Greg and Megan Sutter were never found. The search teams recovered their tent, their gear, their identification. The case remained open for 2 years before being classified as missing, presumed dead. Their families held a memorial service in Anchorage, buried empty caskets in a cemetery overlooking the mountains. But sometimes, in the deep winter, bush pilots flying over Kobuk Valley report seeing figures on the tundra below, 2 of them, always 2, standing motionless in the snow looking up at the planes as they pass. The pilots radio their positions to the Park Service, and search teams are dispatched, and they find nothing. No tracks, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. And in his room in the care facility in Juneau, Ryan Caldwell sits by the window and watches the sky. He doesn't speak anymore. Hasn't spoken in years, but sometimes when the light fades and the shadows lengthen and the silence settles in, the orderlies hear him whispering. 2 words. Always the same 2 words. They're here. And when they check on him, they find him staring at the corner of the room, at the place where the walls meet, at the space between spaces where something stands watching with a face that shifts and blurs and refuses to resolve into anything recognizable. Something that wears his smile, something that's waiting for him to remember how to walk. Location: Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, Georgia. Date: July 28, 2014. On the water in Okefenokee was the color of sweet tea left to steep too long, that deep amber black that came from centuries of decaying vegetation, leaching tannins into the slow-moving channels and cypress-shadowed pools. Chloe had been studying these waters for 3 years now, mapping the complex ecosystem of the swamp, cataloging the health of its apex predators, learning to read its moods the way some people read weather. She'd come to understand that Okefenokee wasn't a single place, but 1,000 places layered on top of each other. The surface world of water and cypress knees and Spanish moss, and something older beneath, something that had been here long before the Creek people named it Land of the Trembling Earth. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 weeks, she'd risen before dawn in her cabin at the Stevens Sea, Foster State Park, and made her way down to the boat launch with a thermos of coffee and a growing sense of unease. The alligators were dying. Not the slow attrition of old age or territorial disputes that she'd documented in her research, but something else. Something that left their massive bodies floating belly up in the channels, unmarked, uninjured, their eyes filmed over with a white haze that spoke of death by terror rather than trauma. 14 gators in 2 weeks, ranging from 6-foot juveniles to a 12-foot bull that had been the undisputed king of the Billy's Lake territory. No disease markers, no signs of poisoning. Nothing in the necropsy results that explained why apex predators at the top of the food chain were dying like fish in a poisoned pond. The refugee manager, a tired man named Harold who'd been running Okefenokee since before Chloe was born, had called it one of those things. But Chloe had seen the look in his eyes when he said it, the flicker of something that might have been recognition, or might have been fear. She'd tried to press him for more information, and he'd changed the subject with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his whole life not talking about certain things. That was the way of it down here, Chloe was learning. The old-timers who lived in the communities surrounding the swamp, Fargo, Folkestone, the scattered fishing camps that dotted the refuge's borders, they all had that same look. That same careful way of not saying things. She'd heard whispers in the diner where she ate breakfast, fragments of conversation that stopped when she approached. Something in the water, the old-timers said. Something that's been there longer than the gators. Something that's waking up. Chloe didn't believe in swamp monsters. She believed in data, in observable phenomena, in the clean logic of scientific methodology. But 3 years in Okefenokee had taught her that the swamp operated by its own logic, and that logic didn't always align with what she'd learned in graduate school. She finished her coffee as the first light crept across the water, painting the cypress trees in shades of gold and shadow. The morning chorus was starting, the prehistoric bellowing of bull gators announcing their territories, the splash of fish breaking the surface, the endless sawing of insects that formed the swamp's constant background music. Everything sounded normal. Everything looked normal. But beneath the familiar sounds, Chloe could feel something else, a subsonic vibration that seemed to come from the water itself. A frequency too low to hear, but just present enough to set her teeth on edge. Her radio crackled. "Dr. Chen, this is Refuge HQ, you copy?" Chloe keyed the mic. "HQ, this is Chen. Go ahead. We've got a situation out at the Suwannee Canal. Fishermen reported overdue last night. 2 locals, Butch Tanner and Wayne Creech. They were running trot lines in the canal system and never came back. Their truck's still at the launch. Can you take your boat out that way, see if you spot anything?" The Suwannee Canal was about 4 miles east, a man-made waterway that cut through some of the most remote sections of the refuge. Good fishing, if you knew what you were doing, but treacherous for the uninitiated. Maze-like side channels, submerged logs, water that could go from 3 feet deep to 15 in the space of a paddle stroke. "Copy, HQ. I'm heading out now. Any description of their boat?" 14-foot John boat, green with a 25-horse Yamaha outboard. Registration numbers Georgia 7743 Alpha. "Got it. I'll radio when I have something. Chen out." Chloe untied her research skiff and pushed off from the dock, the electric trolling motor humming quietly as she navigated out of the launch area and into the main channel. The sun was fully up now, but struggling to penetrate the canopy of cypress and tupelo that arched over the waterway, leaving the swamp in a perpetual twilight that felt more like dusk than morning. Spanish moss hung from the branches in gray curtains, swaying in a breeze Chloe couldn't feel. and the water beneath her hull was so dark she couldn't see more than a few inches below the surface. She'd been on the water for perhaps an hour, following the marked channel toward the Suwannee Canal, when she noticed the silence. It happened all at once, the way a door closes. One moment the swamp was alive with sound, birds, insects, the distant rumble of a bull gator, and the next, nothing. Absolute, crushing silence, broken only by the soft whine of her trolling motor and the gentle slap of water against the hull. Chloe killed the motor and drifted, listening. The silence pressed against her ears like physical weight, thick and suffocating in the humid air. She could hear her own heartbeat, her own breathing, the tiny sounds of her body that were normally masked by the world around her. Nothing else. Not a single bird, not a single frog. The swamp had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if every living thing for miles around had decided, simultaneously, to hold its breath. Chloe had experienced this before once during her first year in Okefenokee. She'd been collecting water samples near Chesser Island when the silence had fallen, and she'd looked up to see a massive alligator, easily 14 feet, sliding past her boat with its eyes fixed on something in the water ahead. Predator focus, she'd thought at the time. The swamp goes quiet when something dangerous is hunting. But there was nothing in the water now. Nothing visible anyway. Just the dark surface, still as glass, reflecting the twisted shapes of the cypress trees above. And then, at the edge of her vision, something moved. Butch Tanner had been fishing Okefenokee since he was old enough to hold a rod, and he'd never seen anything like what he saw that night. The trip had started normal enough. He and Wayne had launched just before sunset, planning to run their trot lines through the night and pull in a haul of catfish and bream to sell at the market in Waycross. They knew the Suwannee Canal like they knew their own backyards. Every snag, every deep hole, every spot where the big cats like to hide. They'd been doing this run for 20 years since they were teenagers, sneaking out in Wayne's daddy's boat with a cooler full of beer and more confidence than sense. The first sign of trouble came around midnight. They were checking a line near the junction of the canal and a narrow side channel when Wayne's flashlight caught something in the water, not a gator. They knew gators, knew the way their eyes reflected red in a spotlight, knew the distinctive shape of their snouts breaking the surface. This was different, bigger, a dark mass moving just below the surface, longer than their boat by half again, leaving a wake that rocked them hard enough to slosh water over the gunnels. The hell was that? Wayne had whispered, and Butch had shushed him because suddenly the swamp was silent and Butch could feel something watching them from the darkness, something with an intelligence that had nothing to do with animal instinct. They'd pulled anchor and headed for home. That was the smart play, the safe play, and both of them had been fishing these waters long enough to know when to cut their losses. But the channel that should have led them back to the main waterway wasn't there anymore. In its place was a wall of cypress, their trunks packed so close together, a minnow couldn't have swum between them. "This ain't right," Wayne had said, his voice climbing toward panic. "This ain't right, Butch. This channel goes straight through. It's always gone straight through." Butch didn't answer. He was staring at the cypress wall, at the way the trees seemed to lean toward their boat, their branches reaching out like fingers. The bark was wrong, too dark, almost black, and there was something growing on it. Not moss, not lichen, something that looked almost like scales. They tried another channel. Same result. Another wall of trees that shouldn't have been there. Another dead end in a waterway Butch had navigated 1,000 times. The swamp was closing around them, he realized, folding in on itself, trapping them in a space that was getting smaller with every turn. That was when they heard the singing. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a low humming sound that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite words. It vibrated through the water, through the hull of the boat, through Butch's bones. Wayne clapped his hands over his ears and started praying, the Lord's Prayer, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush. But Butch couldn't look away from the water, from the dark shape that was rising toward the surface. It was bigger than anything that should exist. That was Butch's first coherent thought, the last rational observation his mind would make before terror took over completely. Bigger than any gator, bigger than any fish, bigger than the boat they sat in. The shape broke the surface perhaps 20 feet away, and in the beam of his flashlight, Butch saw something that would haunt whatever remained of his life. A head, vaguely serpentine, but with features that suggested something older, something that had been swimming these waters before the first human ever set foot in Georgia. Eyes that reflected the light with a deep amber glow, the same color as the water itself. A mouth that opened to reveal rows of teeth, not sharp like a predator's, but flat, grinding, the teeth of something that didn't need to chase its prey because its prey couldn't escape. The singing grew louder. Butch felt his hands moving of their own accord, reaching toward the water, toward the thing that waited there. Beside him, Wayne had stopped praying and was doing the same, his eyes glassy, his face slack with something that might have been terror, or might have been rapture. "Don't fight it," a voice said, and Butch realized it was coming from his own mouth, words in a language he didn't speak but somehow understood. "Don't fight it. The water's been waiting for you. The water's been waiting so long." The boat tipped. The dark water closed over Butch's head. And then there was only the singing, and the cold, and the feeling of something ancient wrapping around him like a mother's arms. Chloe found the boat at the junction of the Suwannee Canal and the side channel the locals called Dead Man's Cut, a name she'd always assumed was colorful exaggeration. The John boat was floating upside down, its green hull sun-bleached to the color of old limes, the outboard motor hanging at an angle that suggested violent capsizing rather than gradual swamping. No sign of the fishermen, no sign of struggle. Just an empty boat and the silence that had followed Chloe since she'd entered this section of the swamp. "HQ, this is Chen. I've found the vessel at the junction of Suwannee Canal and Dead Man's Cut. Boat is capsized, no sign of the occupants. I'm going to search the immediate area." Static. Then faintly, "Chen, copy. Careful. HQ, say again? You're breaking up." Nothing. Just the hiss of dead air, and beneath it, something that might have been breathing, slow and deep and patient. Chloe turned the radio off. She maneuvered her skiff alongside the capsized John boat, using her paddle to probe the water around it. The depth here was impossible to gauge. Her paddle went down 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, and never touched bottom. The tannin-dark water revealed nothing, its surface smooth as obsidian, reflecting her face back at her in distorted fragments. There was a smell, she realized. Not the usual swamp smell of decay and vegetation, but something older. Something that made her think of deep ocean trenches and the things that lived in darkness, where sunlight never reached. It was coming from the water itself, rising up in waves that intensified whenever her boat drifted closer to the capsized John boat. Chloe reached over the side to grab the John boat's hull, intending to right it and check for any evidence of what had happened. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the water beneath her skiff erupted. She had an impression of size, vast, incomprehensible size, and of movement that was far too fast for something so large. Her skiff rocked violently, throwing her against the gunwale hard enough to bruise ribs. Water slopped over the sides. That dark tea-colored water that suddenly felt less like water and more like something else. Something that clung to her skin with an almost hungry persistence. And she saw it, just for a moment in the chaos of spray and motion. A shape beneath the surface, longer than her boat, longer than any living thing had a right to be. Scales that caught the filtered sunlight and threw it back in amber glints. An eye, just one, rolling toward her with an intelligence that was neither animal nor human but something else entirely, something that had been old when the first fish crawled onto land. The shape descended. The water settled. Chloe sat frozen in her rocking boat, her hands gripping the paddle so hard her knuckles had gone white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence was total now. Even her own breathing seemed muffled, as if the swamp were wrapping itself around her, isolating her from the rest of the world. "Okay," she whispered, and her voice sounded thin and strange in the vacuum of sound. "Okay, time to go." She reached for the trolling motor and stopped. There was a man standing on the water. Not in the water. On it. perhaps 30 feet away at the edge of the channel where the cypress trees crowded close to the bank. He was wearing overalls and a checked shirt, the kind of outfit she'd seen on 100 local fishermen, and he was looking at her with an expression of terrible sadness. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said. His voice carried clearly across the water, impossible clarity in the dead silence. "This ain't a place for the living anymore. Who are you?" Chloe's voice cracked. "How are you standing on the water?" The man smiled, and his smile was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "I'm Butch," he said. "I used to be Butch. Now I'm part of it. We're all part of it now, everyone who ever drowned in these waters, everyone who ever got lost and couldn't find their way back. It collects us. It keeps us. And it's been so lonely, Dr. Chen. So lonely for so long." The water around Chloe's boat began to move. Not waves. Something beneath the surface, circling, tightening like a noose. "It knows your name," Butch continued, and his voice was changing, becoming something deeper, something that resonated in frequencies human vocal cords couldn't produce. "It's known your name since you first came to these waters. It's been watching you. It's been waiting. The alligators were offerings, gifts, to show you what it could do, to show you why you should be afraid." Chloe grabbed her paddle and drove it into the water, pushing off from nothing, trying to build momentum toward the main channel. Her skiff lurched forward, once, twice, and stopped dead, as if something had grabbed the hull from beneath. "You can't leave," Butch said, and now there were others appearing beside him, figures emerging from the trees, stepping onto the water's surface with the casual ease of people walking on solid ground. A woman in a sundress that might have been fashionable 50 years ago. A boy in shorts no older than 10. An old man with a fishing rod still clutched in his transparent hands. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all watching her with eyes that glowed amber in the swamp's perpetual twilight. "It's not so bad," the boy said, and his voice was the voice of something ancient speaking through a child's mouth. "You don't feel anything after the first part. You just become part of the water, part of the singing. You'll understand. Everyone understands eventually." The water began to rise. Chloe screamed then, a sound she didn't recognize as coming from her own throat. She stabbed her paddle into the dark water again and again, fighting for purchase, fighting for distance, fighting against the current that was pulling her toward the gathered dead. The trolling motor, she fumbled for the switch, found it, twisted it to full power. The motor whined, strained against whatever was holding the boat. And then she was moving. Slowly at first, then faster, tearing free of whatever grip had held her. The figures on the water watched her go, their faces impassive, their amber eyes tracking her flight with patience that spanned centuries. "We'll be here," Butch called after her, his voice following her through the channels, through the cypress corridors, all the way back to the refuge headquarters where she stumbled from her boat and collapsed on the dock, unable to speak, unable to explain what she had seen. "We'll always be here. And the water remembers, Dr. Chen. The water always remembers." They searched for Butch Tanner and Wayne Creech for 8 days, brought in dive teams, sonar equipment, volunteers from 3 counties. The divers refused to go back after the second day. They'd found something on the bottom of Dead Man's Cut, they said. Something they couldn't describe, something that had looked at them through the murky water with eyes that glowed amber in their flashlight beams. The official report listed the channel as too hazardous for continued search operations. The bodies were never recovered. Chloe resigned from her position 2 weeks later. She told the refugee manager she'd received a better offer, a research position in Arizona studying desert ecosystems. Harold had just nodded, that same knowing look in his eyes, and wished her well. He didn't ask what she'd seen. He didn't need to. She lives in Tucson now, as far from standing water as she could get. She hasn't set foot in a swamp, a lake, or a river in 10 years. She takes showers instead of baths. She doesn't own a pool. But some nights when the monsoon rains come and the desert washes fill with muddy water, Chloe wakes to the sound of singing. Low, humming, wordless music that seems to rise from the earth itself, from aquifers deep beneath the desert floor, from water that remembers even when people try to forget. And sometimes in the moments between sleeping and waking, she sees them, Butch and Wayne and all the others, standing on water that shouldn't exist, their amber eyes patient and waiting. The water remembers. The water is always waiting. And sooner or later, the water always collects what it's owed. Location: Voyageurs National Park, Minnesota. Date: February 2, 2003. The alarm on James Whitmore's watch chimed at 5 in the morning, pulling him from a sleep that had been shallow and troubled. The ranger station was cold, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight as he swung his feet out of the narrow cot and onto the frozen floor. February in Voyageurs National Park was a particular kind of harsh. The lake had been frozen solid for 6 weeks now. The winter had carved away everything that even remotely resembled comfort, and the nearest other human being was 47 miles away at the main park headquarters in International Falls. James had chosen this posting specifically because of the isolation. He was a ranger with 13 years of experience in the National Park Service, and he had spent the first 10 of those at popular parks, where summer crowds pressed against the infrastructure, where visitor safety was a daily negotiation between education and enforcement. After a divorce that had taken more than his marriage, and a job stress that had started manifesting as physical symptoms he didn't want to name, James had requested a winter season assignment to Voyageurs' northern sector, somewhere quiet, somewhere where the only person he had to manage was himself. He dressed in the darkness: thermal base layers, heavy wool socks, flannel shirt, down-filled parka, insulated gloves. The station's thermostat read -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the wind was running at sustained speeds of 23 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 30. The National Weather Service had issued a winter weather advisory that extended through the following afternoon. All but essential personnel had been authorized to shelter in place. James was essential personnel. He made coffee on the station's ancient stove, the propane heater and standard outlets being backup systems that James had long ago stopped fully trusting. The coffee ritual had become meditative, a small moment of warmth and routine in the crushing monotony of deep winter. While the coffee brewed, James looked out the station window at the landscape that had become his entire world for the past 3 months. Voyageurs stretched across 218,000 acres of boreal forest and glacially carved shoreline in the far north of Minnesota, perched on the border with Canada and separated from civilization by water that was now solid enough to drive across. The lake itself, a complex system of bays and channels, was utterly frozen, locked in ice that was somewhere between 30 and 40 inches thick depending on location. The landscape beyond the frozen water was pure northern forest: spruce, jack pine, aspen, all bent by wind and heavily laden with snow. The sunlight, what there was of it, rose at 7:30 and set again by 4:30. In the long hours of darkness in between, the only light came from stars and the moon when it was visible, and the occasional aurora borealis that painted the sky in shades of green and purple and ghostly white. The forest in winter was quiet in a way that James had never encountered before his assignment to Voyageurs. It wasn't the absence of sound. There was sound, plenty of it. Wind moving through the trees, the crack of ice shifting on the lake, a sound like distant gunfire, the occasional howl of a wolf pack that hunted the far shore. What was unusual was the quality of the silence. It felt present. It felt deliberate. It felt as if something was listening. James drank his coffee and studied the day's assignments. One check of the visitor center at the southern dock, unmanned in winter, but the building needed regular inspection for animal intrusion and structural integrity. One inventory run of the station's emergency supplies. One perimeter patrol along the frozen shoreline to check for any changes in the ice conditions or signs of human activity. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Just the routine maintenance of a park that had largely entered hibernation and was waiting for spring to return life to its frozen surface. By 6:30, James was loading the station's small motor launch onto the trailer that he would pull across the frozen lake toward the visitor center. The boat itself was unnecessary. He could walk across the ice if he wanted. but protocol required that transport be available in case emergency access to open water became necessary. In theory, open water at this time of year was impossible. In practice, James had learned to keep transportation ready. Wilderness didn't always follow the rules written by people in offices. The first part of the drive was across the bay near the station, where the ice was thick and visibly solid. As James moved deeper into the lake system, following the route that he had mapped and verified repeatedly over the previous 3 months, the ice beneath the wheels began to show variation. Areas where it was white and opaque, areas where it was clear and blue, areas where pressure ridges had buckled the surface into formations that looked almost geological in scale. He was halfway to the visitor center when he heard the voice. It came through the frozen landscape, carried on the wind that was gusting across the open ice. A voice calling his name. A woman's voice. A voice he recognized absolutely, with a certainty that made his chest tighten and his hands grip the steering wheel involuntarily. It was his ex-wife's voice. Sarah, who had left him 18 months ago, who had moved to California, who should have been 3,000 miles away instead of somehow calling to him across the frozen lake in February. James stopped the truck. The engine idled, the heater running full blast, blowing warm air that fogged the windshield. He looked out at the landscape around him. Nothing but ice and distance and the dark shapes of trees on the far shoreline. He keyed the radio on the dashboard. "Station, this is Unit 1 Mobile. I'm hearing something unusual on the ice. Sound distortion, probably wind. Continuing to visitor center. Will advise." The response came back fragmentary, the signal weak at this distance. "Copy Unit 1, visibility, be careful. Ice conditions." James acknowledged and continued driving. The voice didn't come again. The wind moved across the ice, making sounds that could almost be human speech if a person was tired enough, isolated enough, lonely enough to want them to be. What James didn't know was that Victoria Walsh, a backcountry researcher from the University of Minnesota, had been missing from her research camp since the previous afternoon. Victoria had arrived at Voyageurs 3 weeks earlier on a grant to study wolfpack behavior during winter. She had established a research camp on the northern shore of the lake, roughly 8 miles from the nearest ranger station. She was an experienced wildlife researcher, a woman who had spent the last 6 years studying carnivore predation patterns in boreal forests. She had supplied her camp with everything needed for a 3-month research season: food, medical supplies, communication equipment, shelter rated for temperatures down to -40 degrees. She had disappeared while doing a routine tracking expedition, following a wolf pack that had been active in the area for the preceding week. The last communication she had sent was via satellite phone to her research coordinator on February 1st, in the early afternoon. Following pack to the northwest, beautiful animals. Behavior today is unusual. They're hunting something larger than their normal prey base. Almost coordinated, organized. Will report again by 1800 hours. The message had been received. No follow-up communication had come. When Victoria's research camp was discovered to be abandoned and her equipment still in place, an alert had been issued. But the winter conditions and the extreme isolation meant that search and rescue operations couldn't be mounted until conditions improved. The closest authorities to Voyageurs were stretched thin, covering a vast geographic area. A missing researcher in a clearly prepared camp, during a season when she had explicitly chosen to be isolated, was a lower priority than immediate threats to life in populated areas. That had been 18 hours ago. Victoria's reality had diverged from normal human experience sometime during the early morning hours of February 2nd. She had been following the wolf pack, tracking their movements through a stretch of boreal forest, roughly 4 miles northwest of her camp. The wolves were beautiful. A large pack, perhaps 12 animals, moving with the coordinated precision of a hunting unit that had spent years learning to work together. But something about their behavior was different from what Victoria had observed before. They weren't moving randomly or following a scent trail in the pattern that predators typically followed. They were herding. They were moving in a pattern that suggested they were driving something ahead of them, driving it toward a specific location. Victoria had become so focused on documenting this unusual behavior that she had stopped paying attention to her own location. She had stopped checking her GPS. stopped marking her position, stopped doing the basic wilderness safety protocols that she had taught herself through 6 years of field research. By the time she realized that the landscape was no longer matching her mental map of the area, she had walked far deeper into the forest than she had intended. The wolves had faded away into the darkness. Victoria was alone in a landscape of thick spruce trees and deep snow, with only her snowshoes and her growing panic for company. She had tried to navigate back to the camp using landmarks, but the landmarks didn't look right. The trees were too similar. The terrain seemed to repeat. She would be certain she was moving southeast, following the river valley that would lead back to civilization, and then she would recognize a distinctive spruce tree that she had already passed, a formation of rocks that she had already noted. The forest was circling back on itself, or she was circling back on herself. Victoria couldn't determine which, and the distinction seemed increasingly irrelevant. It was when she finally stopped, exhausted and disoriented, that she noticed the smell. It was a smell of something old and organic, a smell of decay and something worse than decay, a smell of predation and hunger, the smell of something that had been eating things, eating them poorly, leaving scraps and remains to rot in the cold. The smell seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of her, deeper into the forest. Victoria should have turned back. Her training, her experience, every instinct she had cultivated through years of working safely in wilderness environments was screaming at her to retrace her steps and return to camp. But underneath the fear was curiosity. That's what her dissertation advisor had always said about Victoria, what her colleagues knew about her. She had an almost reckless curiosity about animal behavior, a willingness to follow patterns and phenomena deeper than wisdom dictated. She moved toward the smell. The source of the odor was a clearing, roughly 100 meters in circumference, surrounded by dense spruce trees. In the center of the clearing was something that made Victoria's mind struggle to process what she was seeing. It was a shape, a bipedal shape, roughly human-sized but definitely not human. It was covered in what might have been fur, or might have been skin, or might have been something that was neither and both. It was crouched over something on the ground, something that was definitely human-sized, definitely a body, definitely the remains of something that had once been a living person. Victoria's scream came out as a choked gasp. The shape turned toward her. It was then that Victoria understood with a terrible clarity that the wolves hadn't been hunting at all. They had been herding. They had been herding something for a specific predator. They had been working with it, coordinated and patient, driving prey into a location where something ancient and hungry was waiting. The shape made a sound, not a howl, not an animal sound of any kind. It was a sound like wind moving through a cave, like the sound of something very large trying to produce human speech from a mouth that had never been shaped for language. When it spoke, it used a woman's voice. A woman's voice that sounded almost like Victoria's own voice, but slightly wrong, the intonation off, the emphasis in the wrong places. "Don't run," the thing said. "I've been waiting for you. I've been hungry for so very long." Victoria ran. She crashed through the snow and underbrush, her snowshoes catching and tearing, one of them coming loose completely. She was half running, half falling through the forest, her vision blurred with panic and cold-induced tears that froze immediately on her face. Behind her, she could hear it moving. It was very fast, faster than something so large should be able to move through heavy snow. She could hear its breathing, a sound like wind moving through dead branches, and underneath that, a sound of anticipation, hunger, a hunger that had been building for longer than Victoria could comprehend. She ran until her lungs were burning and her legs wouldn't cooperate. She ran until she fell, face first into a snowbank so deep that she disappeared completely beneath the surface. She lay there gasping, trying to control her breathing so that the sound of her panic wouldn't give away her position. The thing moved past her. She could hear it, perhaps only 15 feet away, circling, searching. It made that horrible sound again. The sound of attempted human speech mangled into something predatory and wrong. It was calling her name. It was calling her name using her own voice, perfectly mimicked, preserved from the moment she had screamed it. Victoria stayed buried in the snow until the sound of its movement faded. Then she waited longer. Long enough to be certain it was gone, long enough for the cold to begin seeping into her body with a persistence that made her movements sluggish and her thinking confused. She crawled out of the snow and started walking. Not toward camp, away. Just away from the thing in the forest. Away from the clearing where bodies were being collected and consumed. Away from a predator that seemed to move with absolute knowledge of the landscape, that seemed to understand what prey would do, before the prey understood it themselves. By the time morning came, a morning that never got particularly bright, just a slight lessening of the darkness, Victoria was completely lost. She had no idea which direction led to camp, which direction led to civilization, which direction led deeper into the wilderness. She had no idea if she was walking toward rescue or toward a deeper isolation that would eventually kill her just as effectively as the thing that was hunting her. All she knew was that the thing was still there, still hunting her, still circling, moving in and out of her field of vision, sometimes close enough that she could hear its breathing, sometimes far enough away that she could almost convince herself that it had moved on. Sometimes it called to her using her own voice. Sometimes it called using the voice of the researcher who had gone missing the winter before. Sometimes it called using voices she didn't recognize, but that sounded so desperately human that she nearly responded before she caught herself. James finished his station checks by early afternoon. The visitor center was secure, the supplies were logged, and the equipment was functional. He had maintained the protocols that kept him sane in the isolation: task completion, routine verification, procedural adherence. The rituals of professional responsibility were a bulwark against the creeping sense of wrongness that he had been experiencing since arriving at Voyageurs. The drive back to the station was supposed to take roughly an hour across the frozen lake. The route was clear, the ice conditions were consistent, and there were no weather advisories that would prevent safe transit. He never made it back to the station. Approximately halfway across the lake in the open area between islands, James noticed that the ice beneath his truck was beginning to show unusual characteristics. The color was changing, shifting from white to a dark blue, then to a black that was so absolute it seemed to absorb light. The truck's wheels were no longer crunching on solid ice. They were moving through something that looked like ice, but that seemed to be absorbing the sound of his passage, muffling it, deadening it. James stopped the truck. He got out and examined the ice directly. It felt cold, standard for February on an Arctic lake, but when he pressed his hand against it, he felt something moving beneath the surface. Not fish, something larger, something that was moving with deliberate intelligence. That's when he heard Victoria calling. She was calling from somewhere out on the ice. Not visible, obscured by the slight haze that the wind was creating, but definitely there. She was calling his name, calling it the way a person calls for help, with desperation and fear and the terrible certainty of someone who knows they are about to die. James! Oh God, James, please help me. It's still here. It's still hunting. James moved toward the sound. Later, he would question whether he had made a conscious decision, or whether something about the call, something in the way his own name was spoken with such desperate need, had simply overridden his ability to think rationally. He was 20 feet from his truck when he saw her. It was Victoria Walsh, or a very good approximation of Victoria Walsh. She was standing on the dark ice, her clothes tattered, her skin pale with cold, her eyes wide and desperate. She was reaching toward him. "It's going to kill me," she said. "It's been hunting me since yesterday. It has so many voices. It keeps calling to me. It took my research partner last year. I can hear her. I can hear her voice coming from inside it. Please, please help me." James was running toward her before he had fully processed what he was seeing. She was in trouble. She needed help. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that he was making a mistake, that the ice beneath him was no longer solid and he should not be running toward something that didn't make sense. But she needed help. Victoria reached out and grabbed his hand. Her fingers were ice cold, her grip desperate. She pulled him, trying to drag him forward on the ice. "Run," she said. "We have to run. It's coming. It can move under the ice. It can come up anywhere. We have to get to land." James looked behind them. He saw nothing, just darkness and ice and wind. But he heard something, a sound beneath the ice, moving parallel to them, a sound like something enormous moving through water with a terrible, patient hunger. He ran with Victoria toward the shore. The ice cracked beneath their feet, not the normal surface cracking from temperature expansion, but deep cracks that suggested the frozen surface was fracturing under pressure from below. Something was moving underneath, something large enough to crack ice from beneath. They were perhaps 50 meters from the shore when the ice beneath them simply ceased to exist. They fell into water that was so cold it seemed to stop time itself. James went under completely, his breath driven from his lungs by the shock of the temperature. He surged back to the surface, gasping, his entire body already beginning to seize from the cold. Victoria was beside him, her mouth open in a scream that produced no sound, only air. She was trying to swim toward the ice shelf at the edge of the lake, but the cold was already compromising her motor control. That's when James saw it. It rose from beneath them, a shape so large that it displaced water like a submarine surfacing. It had skin that was gray and hairless, and covered in what looked like old scars. It had a face that was almost human, but stretched, distorted, shaped by centuries of predation into something that only approximated the human form. It had eyes that were sunken and hungry, and reflecting James's flashlight beam like something ancient looking back from the bottom of the world. It had teeth, so many teeth. Teeth that overlapped, that seemed to continue far back into its throat. Teeth that suggested a mouth designed for consuming things, for tearing, for eating in a way that was divorced from any normal predatory behavior. The thing opened that mouth and spoke. It spoke in Victoria's voice perfectly, with every inflection and tone precisely preserved. "Welcome to the hunger, James. I've been waiting for you. I've been hungry for you since the beginning." James understood in that moment that Victoria was no longer in the water with him, that Victoria had been dead for hours, that what he was pulling toward the ice shelf was not a human being, but a lure, a reproduction, a tool that the hunger used to bring prey to itself. He let go of her. She sank beneath the dark water without struggle. The cold was becoming everything. James's muscles were no longer responding to conscious command. His vision was beginning to tunnel. He had perhaps 2 minutes before hypothermia would claim him completely. The thing reached for him with hands that were almost human, but with fingers that were far too long, far too articulated, capable of movements that human joints couldn't achieve. Its fingers brushed his shoulder and James felt pain, not from cold, but from the contact itself, a sensation of being marked, evaluated, prepared. It pulled him under. The official report on the disappearance of Ranger James Whitmore and researcher Victoria Walsh noted that both individuals had likely fallen through thin ice while conducting routine patrols near the frozen lake system. The ice had been stable according to initial readings, but pressure ridges and warming trends could have created weak spots. Both individuals were highly experienced wilderness operators. Their bodies have never been recovered. The circumstances were determined to be consistent with accidental death through drowning and hypothermia. The incident was classified as a cold water fatality and closed after standard SAR operations were suspended due to winter weather and dangerous conditions. 3 months later, when the ice began to thaw in spring, a fishing vessel would discover something unusual near the northern shore of Voyager's Lake. It was a body that seemed to have been in the water for far longer than 3 months. It was wearing clothes from the 1970s. It was partially consumed, and the ranger station crew would note with great confusion that the body appeared to be smiling. But that discovery would come after the spring thaw. In February, the winter kept its secrets beneath the ice, and in the deep cold, in the places where the water never froze completely, something moved through the depths with satisfaction. It had fed. It had added new voices to its collection. It had marked the landscape with human remains that would take decades to be discovered, if they were ever discovered at all. The Wendigo had been waiting in those waters for centuries. It had learned to hunt with patience, It had learned to use the wolf packs as tools, herding prey toward its feeding grounds. It had learned to mimic human voices so perfectly that humans would run toward their own deaths, drawn by the voices of people they loved, people who had already been consumed, people whose essence the Wendigo had absorbed through the act of feeding. It would wait now for the next human who ventured into its territory. It would wait with the patience of something that had centuries to refine its hunger. It would learn new voices, new names, new methods of calling the living down into the dark, cold places where it could consume them slowly, methodically, preserving their voices for future hunts. In the spring, rangers would find the visitor center strangely disturbed. There were ice patterns on the inside of the windows that resembled faces. There were marks on the walls that looked like fingernail scratches, though the patterns were too large, too deliberately spaced to match any human hand. And in the supply log of James Whitmore's final entries, the maintenance crew would discover a note written in handwriting that was almost James's own, but slightly off, the letter formations uncertain. The cold is beautiful here. I understand it now. I understand the hunger. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready to let it in. I'm ready to join the voices beneath the ice. I can hear them calling. Victoria is here. Everyone is here. Everyone is home. No one would ever determine if the note had been written by James before he died, or if it had been written by something pretending to be James after his death. No one would ever understand the distinction.